The sound that shattered Isabella Thorne's world wasn't a gunshot or a scream. It was a laugh. Not a chuckle, but a deep, rolling, condescending laugh that echoed off the cold marble floors and floor-to-ceiling glass of their Greenwich mansion. It was the sound of absolute power, the sound of a man who believed he was a god in his own universe. Her husband, Bruno Thorne, the titan of Wall Street, wiped a tear of mirth from his eye, his Brioni suit unruffled. "A divorce," he scoffed. "Darling, on what grounds? You have everything. Don't be ridiculous." He thought her threat was a joke. He was wrong. And in a packed courtroom, weeks later, when his own lawyer stood up, the laughter would die forever. Life in the Thorne mansion was an exercise in curated perfection. Everything had its place, its price, its purpose. The Jean-Michel Basquiat painting in the foyer was for impressing business rivals. The temperature-controlled wine cellar filled with vintages, like Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, was for sealing deals. The fleet of cars, the McLaren for Bruno's weekends, the Bentley for their rare public outings, was a testament to his dominance. And Isabella Rossi Thorne, with her quiet grace and art history degree, was the most beautiful and carefully managed asset of them all. To the outside world, she lived a fairy tale. To herself, she was a ghost, haunting the halls of her own life. Bruno didn't see her. He saw a reflection of his success. He didn't speak to her. He issued decrees. Their conversations were transactions. The charity gala for the Met is on Thursday. Wear the sapphire necklace, he'd say, not looking up from the glowing screens of his home trading terminal. "I was thinking of visiting my aunt in Boston next month," she might venture. "Unnecessary. I need you here for the investor dinner on the 12th. Send her a gift basket from Harrods. Bill it to the household account." Bruno Thorne had not built his hedge fund Thorne Capital on sentiment. He had built it on ruthless logic and an almost supernatural ability to predict market fluctuations. His proprietary algorithm, a black box of code known only as Prometheus, was the stuff of Wall Street legend. It devoured data and spat out fortunes. He treated his marriage the same way a system with inputs and outputs, where emotion was an inefficient variable to be minimized. The day she finally broke was unremarkable. It was a Tuesday. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows overlooking the Long Island Sound. Bruno was on a conference call, his voice a low, commanding growl as he orchestrated the financial fate of a company halfway across the world. Isabella stood in the doorway of his office holding a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was her father's journal. She waited. For 10 minutes, she stood there, invisible. When he finally ended the call, he spun in his leather chair, a Patek Philippe watch glinting on his wrist. He didn't acknowledge her presence, instead immediately barking into his phone's speaker. "Janet, get me the analytics on the Nikkei futures. Now." "Bruno, Isabella," said her voice, barely a whisper. He held up a single dismissive finger. He finished his call, then finally turned his gaze to her. It was the look a man gives a piece of furniture that is slightly out of place. "What is it? I want to talk." "I'm busy, Isabella. Can't it wait?" "No," she said, a flicker of an unknown strength in her voice. She stepped into the room. The air crackled. It was the first time she had ever defied a direct, albeit unspoken, order. "I want a divorce." And that's when he laughed. It started as a low rumble in his chest and erupted into a full-throated roar of disbelief and amusement. He leaned back in his chair, slapping his mahogany desk. "A divorce. Darling, on what grounds? Inconvenient boredom." He gestured around the room at the priceless art, the view, the sheer opulence. "You are the most privileged woman in this state. You want for nothing. A court would laugh you out of the building. You have no money of your own, no career. You signed a prenuptial agreement, thicker than a phone book. You'd walk away with a pittance, and I'd make sure that pittance felt like an insult." He stood up and walked over to her, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. He plucked the journal from her hand, glanced at its faded cover with disdain, and tossed it onto a nearby table. Go shopping. Buy yourself another ridiculously expensive handbag. Get this foolishness out of your system, he said, his voice dropping to a cold, flat line. And do not ever bring this up again. Are we clear? Isabella looked at him, her face a pale, unreadable mask. She didn't see the titan of industry. She saw a thief, a hollow man who had built his empire on a lie she had helped him keep. Perfectly, she said, her voice steady. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him to his kingdom of numbers and glass. He watched her go, a smirk playing on his lips. The matter was closed. He had won, as he always did. He picked up the phone. Arthur. It's Bruno, he said, his tone relaxed again. A small domestic issue. My wife had a moment of fantasy. She mentioned the D word. He chuckled. I want you to be ready just in case she gets any more silly ideas. Bury her in paperwork. Make it hurt. You know the drill. On the other end of the line was Arthur Finch, senior partner at Finch, Stratton and Lowe, the most feared divorce and corporate lawyer in New York. Arthur had been Bruno's legal gladiator for 15 years. He was sharp, relentless, and utterly loyal. Considerate handled Bruno. Arthur's voice rasped smooth as aged whiskey. She won't know what hit her. Bruno hung up satisfied. He had his fortress, and he had his guard dog. Isabella didn't stand a chance. That evening, as Bruno entertained a Japanese banking consortium with stories of his financial prowess, Isabella sat in the quiet of the guest cottage at the far end of the estate. The small, leather-bound journal lay open in front of her. She picked up her phone, her hands trembling slightly, and dialed a number she had memorized years ago but had never dared to call. It was not a divorce lawyer. It was not a friend. It was a lifeline to a past Bruno believed he had erased. Professor Davies. Please, she said when a young man answered. My name is Isabella Rossi. It's about my father, Alistair Rossi. I need to talk to him about his work on stochastic resonance. The initial legal salvos were exactly as Bruno had predicted. Arthur Finch, a man whose tailored suits seemed woven from intimidation and legal precedent, unleashed a blizzard of motions. He filed for dismissal, citing the ironclad prenuptial agreement. He issued subpoenas for Isabella's credit card statements, her phone records, her emails, seeking to paint her as a frivolous spendthrift with no grasp of reality. The first meeting was held in the sterile conference room of Arthur's Midtown Manhattan office. The view of Central Park from the 50th floor was breathtaking, a world away from the emotional carnage about to unfold. Bruno sat at the head of the table, flanked by Arthur and a junior associate. He exuded an air of bored tolerance, as if he were indulging a child's tantrum. Isabella sat opposite him, accompanied by a modest middle-aged lawyer named Sarah Jenkins. Jenkins was competent and respected in family law, but she was a rowboat against Arthur Finch's battleship. Bruno had already had her investigated. She was a small-time player. This confirmed his belief that Isabella's attempt at rebellion was amateurish and doomed. Let's be frank. Arthur began, his voice cutting through the silence. Mrs. Thorne, your petition is baseless. The prenuptial agreement signed on May 2008 is unequivocal. In the event of a dissolution of the marriage, you are entitled to the lump sum of $5 million and the apartment on the Upper West Side. My client has generously offered to double that sum to $10 million, provided this matter is concluded within the week, quietly and without fuss. He slid a document across the polished table. Sign this, and you can walk away with a life of comfort and ease. Isabella looked at the document, then at Bruno. His eyes were cold, triumphant. He believed he was buying her silence, her compliance. He was buying her off. Sarah Jenkins cleared her throat. Mr. Finch, my client's petition isn't about contesting the prenup in the traditional sense. We are asserting a claim of fraudulent inducement and misappropriation of assets that predate the marriage and form the very basis of Mr. Thorne's wealth. Bruno let out a short, sharp laugh. What assets I built my company from the ground up with my own two hands. We contend otherwise, Jenkins said calmly. Arthur Finch leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Ms. Jenkins, this is a dangerous and frankly defamatory path to walk. Thorn Capital was founded by Mr. Thorn in 2009. He was the sole architect of its success. Unless you have concrete, irrefutable proof of this misappropriation, I suggest you advise your client to take the generous offer on the table before it is rescinded. Isabella spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady. We have proof. Bruno scoffed, looking at his watch. This is theatre. Arthur, let's move to discovery. Let them waste their time and money chasing ghosts. The discovery process was grueling. Arthur's team demanded mountains of information, burying Isabella and her lawyer in requests. But Sarah Jenkins was methodical. Her requests were fewer, but they were precise. She didn't ask for Thorn Capital's overall financial records. She asked for specific documents, early-stage investor prospectuses from 2009 initial patent applications for the Prometheus algorithm, and most importantly, all of Bruno Thorn's academic records and correspondence from his time as a doctoral student at MIT between 25 and 20. Bruno dismissed the requests as a fishing expedition. Give them whatever they want, Arthur. There's nothing there. The deposition took place a month later. It was a formal, recorded questioning under oath. Bruno was relaxed, almost jovial, parrying Sarah Jenkins's questions with ease. He detailed his meteoric rise, his genius, the long hours he'd put in. And the Prometheus algorithm, Jenkins asked her, tone even. Can you describe its genesis? It was a moment of inspiration, backed by years of research, Bruno said smoothly. I was working on my doctorate studying chaotic systems. I realized that the models used to predict weather patterns could be adapted to financial markets. I saw a pattern no one else did. So you alone conceived of and developed the core mathematical principles. That's correct, Bruno stated, a hint of pride in his voice. You had no collaborator, no partner, none. It was my intellectual property from start to finish. Sarah Jenkins nodded slowly. She opened a file and pulled out a single plastic sleeve document. It was a high-quality color photocopy. She had the original in a safe deposit box. I'd like to mark this as Petitioner's Exhibit A, she said, handing a copy to Arthur and another to Bruno. Bruno glanced at it, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Arthur Finch, however, picked it up with a lawyer's practiced care. His eyes scanned the page, and then he froze. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a scanned page from a letter written on the official letterhead of the MIT Department of Physics, dated April 12, 2007. The handwriting was elegant, precise. My dearest Isabella, it began. Breakthrough. The key wasn't in suppressing the noise, but in harnessing it. The stochastic resonance model I've been working on. It's not just theoretical. I ran a simulation against the S&P 500 historical data, and the predictive accuracy is astounding. That young man Bruno is a bright student, but he remains convinced the only path is through brute force data crunching. He doesn't see the elegance of it. He sees the noise as an obstacle, not the signal itself. I feel I am on the precipice of something revolutionary. I've enclosed a page of my initial equations. See if you can spot the beautiful simplicity in line 3. The letter was signed, All My Love, Dad. Below the text was a series of complex mathematical equations written in the same hand. Bruno looked at it and sneered. What is this? A sentimental letter. Your father was a brilliant academic, Isabella. I've always said that. But he was a theorist. He never built anything. But Arthur Finch wasn't looking at Bruno. He was staring at the equations. He wasn't a mathematician, but over the years, he had handled enough intellectual property disputes for Thorn Capital to recognize the fundamental architecture of the Prometheus code. He had seen early versions' patent filings, and the equations on this page, they were not just similar, They were the blueprint, the core, foundational logic of a $10 billion empire scribbled on a piece of personal correspondence a year before Bruno Thorne claimed to have had his moment of inspiration. Arthur slowly looked up from the page, his gaze locking with Isabella's across the table. For the first time, he didn't see a disgruntled wife. He saw a woman holding a key, and he felt a sudden sickening lurch in his gut. The feeling of a man standing on a foundation he suddenly realized was made not of rock, but of sand. The first crack had appeared. Professor Alistair Rossi was not a man who cared for wealth. His riches were in his mind. He lived in a cluttered Cambridge apartment filled with more books than furniture, smelling faintly of old paper pipe tobacco and brewing tea. His world was one of elegant theories and the pursuit of pure knowledge. He was a physicist of some renown in academic circles, specializing in chaos theory and complex systems. His daughter Isabella was his sun and moon. Unlike her father, Isabella had a mind that was both creative and pragmatic. She had inherited his mathematical brilliance, but grounded it with a love for structure and application. While pursuing her art history degree, she spent her evenings in her father's study, not as a student, but as a collaborator. She helped him code his simulations, organize his research, and challenged his assumptions. They were a team. Their great project in Alistair's final years was a theory he called stochastic resonance modeling. The prevailing wisdom in market prediction was to filter out market noise, the random, unpredictable fluctuations, and find the underlying signal. Alistair's theory was radical. He believed the noise itself was the signal. He theorized that by amplifying the random noise within a system, one could reveal hidden periodic patterns, making the system more predictable, not less. It was a beautiful, counterintuitive idea. Into this world of quiet academic discovery walked Bruno Thorne. He was Alistair's doctoral student, ambitious, charming, and ferociously intelligent. He was dazzled by Professor Rossi's mind, and it seemed by his daughter. He spent hours in their apartment, absorbing Alistair's theories, debating with him and courting Isabella. Isabella was cautious at first, but Bruno was persistent. He truly saw her in a way no one else had. He praised her intellect, her insights into her father's work. "You're the key to all of this." He'd told her one evening over coffee in a small cafe in Harvard Square. "Your father is the genius, but you're the one who makes it speak. You translate his ideas into reality." For the first time, Isabella felt her contributions were truly valued. She fell in love not just with the man, but with the future. He painted a world where her father's legacy would be realized, where their work would change the world. Alistair, however, harbored a quiet reservation about his protege. "He's brilliant," no doubt he told Isabella one night, tamping tobacco into his pipe. "But he's hungry in a way I don't trust. He sees the destination, the prize, but he has no respect for the journey. Be careful, my dear." In the spring of 2008, Alistair Rossi had a massive unexpected stroke. He died within hours. Isabella's world shattered. In the haze of grief, Bruno was her rock. He handled the arrangements, comforted her, and took charge of her father's academic affairs. "We have to protect his work," Bruno had said, his voice soft and sincere, as he held her in the book-filled apartment that now felt cavernously empty. "His papers, his notes, they are his legacy. I'll make sure they are safe, organized. I'll make sure he gets the credit he deserves." Trusting him completely, Isabella gave him the keys to her father's office and his apartment. He spent weeks meticulously going through Alistair's life's work, boxing up papers and digitizing notes. He told her he was creating an archive to be donated to the university. 6 months later, Bruno dropped out of his PhD program. "Academia is too slow." "Izzy," he told her, his eyes blazing with a new fire, "your father's work, it's not meant for dusty journals. It's meant to be used. I've figured out how to apply it. We can build an empire on this." He proposed to her with a flawless diamond that felt cold on her finger. He presented her with a prenuptial agreement drafted by a shrewd lawyer named Arthur Finch. It's just a formality, a business necessity, he'd assured her. Everything I have is ours. Overwhelmed by grief and swept up in his vision, she signed it without reading the fine print too closely. She trusted him. They moved to New York. Bruno founded Thorn Capital. He used his charisma and a stunningly effective pitch deck filled with concepts and equations Isabella recognized as her father's to secure initial funding. He called the algorithm he developed Prometheus, after the titan who stole fire from the gods. At first, Isabella tried to be involved. She'd look at the code, the models. Bruno, this is exactly what Dad was working on, she said, once pointing to a screen. This line here, it's from his journal. His demeanor changed. I took his theories and made them practical, he said sharply. His work was a starting point, a foundation. I'm the one who built the skyscraper. Slowly she was pushed out. Her insights were dismissed as naive. Her questions were treated as interruptions. She was relegated to the role of the beautiful, supportive wife, the hostess, the ornament. The narrative was solidified. Bruno Thorn, the lone genius, had revolutionized Wall Street. Professor Alistair Rossi was a footnote, a mentor from his student days. Isabella Rossi Thorn was a nobody. For years, she lived with the lie. She buried the truth under layers of Chanel and charity events, telling herself it was what her father would have wanted for his work to be used to be successful. But the ghost of her father, the memory of his quiet integrity, haunted her. The journal she had salvaged, the one Bruno had contemptuously tossed aside, was her only tangible link to that past. It wasn't until Bruno laughed at her, laughed at the very idea she could have an identity separate from his, that the dormant grief and sense of injustice ignited into a cold, burning rage. He hadn't just stolen her father's work, he had erased him. He had erased her. Her call to Professor Davies, a former colleague of her father's at MIT, had been her first move. She had flown to Boston and spent 2 days with the elderly, kind-faced academic. Together, they had gone through the archive Bruno had supposedly created for the university. It was pathetically incomplete. Key research papers were missing. The most crucial journals, the ones detailing the final breakthrough on stochastic resonance modeling, were gone. But Bruno had made one arrogant mistake. He hadn't thought to track down Alistair's personal correspondence. Professor Davies had kept every letter Alistair had ever sent him. And in that correspondence, in Alistair's own hand, was the entire story, the theories, the equations, the excitement of discovery, and the repeated documented mentions of his brilliant student Bruno, who just couldn't grasp the core concept. The letter she had presented at the deposition was just the first shot. She had a dozen more just like it. She had her own memories. She had the truth. And now, for the first time, she had the attention of the one man Bruno Thorn trusted above all others. The deposition ended abruptly after the presentation of the letter. Arthur Finch, citing the need to review new evidence, called for a recess. His face was a granite mask, but a muscle jumped in his jaw, a tell that Bruno, in his own agitation, failed to notice. Back in the leather and mahogany fortress of his office, Bruno paced like a caged tiger. It's a stunt, Arthur. A sentimental piece of paper. It proves nothing. Rossi was a theorist. He couldn't balance his own checkbook, let alone build a quantitative hedge fund. Arthur sat behind his desk, the photocopy of the letter laid out before him like a death sentence. He was silent for a long moment, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. The silence unnerved Bruno more than any argument could. Arthur, did you hear me? We crushed them. We filed for sanctions against Jenkins for frivolous claims. We drowned them. I called a friend of mine at the US Patent Office. Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet. I had him pull the original technical filings for Prometheus from 2009. The core schematics. I also called a contact at MIT, a tenured professor in the physics department. I had him fax me 2 pages from a paper Professor Rossi published in 2006 titled Anomalous Signal Amplification in Chaotic Systems. Arthur slid 2 new documents across the desk to join the letter. One was a dense page of code and flowcharts from the patent application. The other was a page of academic theory and equations. They are identical, Bruno, Arthur stated. Not accused, stated. It was a fact. The underlying math, the logic structure. It's not similar. It's a direct, verbatim lift. You didn't build on his work. You plagiarized it. Bruno stopped pacing. His face, usually flushed with confidence, was pale. It's my work. I was his student. The ideas were developed jointly. It's a grey area. There is no grey area in intellectual property theft. Arthur retorted, his voice hardening. And there is certainly no grey area in this letter. He tapped the photocopy. He explicitly writes that you don't see the elegance of it, that you see the noise as an obstacle. This letter, written to his own daughter, is a contemporaneous account that directly refutes your entire narrative. It gives her motive standing and a smoking gun. This isn't a divorce case anymore. This is a federal crime. Wire fraud, securities fraud. The list is extensive. Everything Thorn Capital has ever earned is the fruit of a poisoned tree. Bruno stared at him, a cornered animal. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fury. So what? You're my lawyer. You work for me. Your job is to make this go away. Bury it. Settle it. Pay her whatever she wants. Make her sign an NDA that would choke a horse. That's what I pay you for. Arthur looked at Bruno, and for the first time in 15 years, he didn't see a client or a captain of industry. He saw a common criminal dressed in a $5,000 suit. He saw the smug confession of a man who believed loyalty could be bought and laws were mere suggestions. Arthur Finch had built his career on representing powerful, often difficult men. He had defended the indefensible, had bent the law until it screamed, but he had never knowingly broken it. He had never suborned perjury or concealed an active, ongoing fraud of this magnitude. Bruno wasn't just asking him to defend him from a past crime. He was ordering him to be an accessory to its continuation. I cannot do that, Bruno, Arthur said, his voice flat. What do you mean? You can't, Bruno exploded. Don't you give me a lecture on ethics. Arthur, I pay for your ethics, I own your loyalty. It was the final fatal mistake. That one sentence, I own your loyalty, severed a bond forged over a decade and a half. Arthur Finch's loyalty was to his client, yes, but his ultimate master was the law itself. He was an officer of the court. Bruno, in his boundless hubris, saw him as nothing more than a highly paid servant. Arthur slowly stood up. He was a tall man, and he seemed to draw himself up to his full, formidable height. The predatory glint in his eyes, so often turned on his opponents, was now fixed on Bruno Thorn. No, Bruno. You don't, he said, his voice like chipping ice. You pay for my counsel. Counsel you have consistently ignored. You have lied to me. You have exposed my firm to immense liability. You have built a $10 billion enterprise on a foundation of lies and theft, and you have the audacity to order me to help you perpetuate that fraud. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Bruno. You laughed at her. You dismissed her. You thought she was a decoration. But she had something you never will: integrity. The legacy of an honest man. What are you going to do? Bruno whispered the question, laced with the first real taste of fear he had felt in years. Arthur walked to the door of his office. As of this moment, I am withdrawing as your legal counsel, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. I will be filing the motion with Judge Albright's chambers in the morning. You can't, Bruno snarled, lunging forward. You're bound by attorney-client privilege. Everything I've told you is protected. Arthur paused at the door, turning back to look at his former client. A cold, grim smile touched his lips. You're right. I cannot reveal what you've told me in confidence. but the privilege does not apply to the furthering of a crime or fraud, and it most certainly does not compel me to remain silent when presented with evidence from a third party. He held up the photocopy of Alistair Rossi's letter. This document is not privileged. What it proves is now a matter of public record, and my testimony about when and how I saw it and what it depicts is not privileged either. He opened the door. Find yourself a new lawyer, Bruno. I suspect you're going to need a very good criminal one. He stepped out, closing the door with a soft final click, leaving Bruno Thorne alone in the silent, opulent office, the damning papers scattered on the desk like ashes of his fallen kingdom. The betrayal was complete. The guard dog had not just left the fortress, he was about to show everyone where the secret gate was. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B of the Connecticut Superior Court was thick with tension. The hearing for Thorne v. Thorne was the hottest ticket in the state's legal circles. Rumors had been swirling for weeks since the abrupt and mysterious withdrawal of Arthur Finch from the case. Bruno had been forced to hire a new legal team, a slick but less formidable firm, known more for its aggressive PR than its courtroom prowess. They were expensive, but they lacked Arthur's gravitas. Bruno sat at the defendant's table, a mask of cold fury etched on his face. He'd tried to spin Arthur's departure, leaking stories to the press about creative differences and a need for a more modern approach. But the tremor of uncertainty was there. Isabella sat with Sarah Jenkins, looking composed and calm. She wore a simple navy blue dress, a stark contrast to the flamboyant couture she'd been forced to wear during her marriage. She looked not like a scorned wife, but like a woman on a mission. The gallery was packed with journalists, legal aides, and the morbidly curious. Judge Eleanor Albright, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s, banged her gavel. "Let's get started. Ms. Jenkins, you may begin." Sarah Jenkins stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. The matter before this court is not merely a question of marital assets, but of the fraudulent origin of those assets. We are here to prove that the entirety of Thorne Capital, the financial entity at the heart of this dispute, was founded upon stolen intellectual property belonging to the petitioner's late father, Dr. Alistair Rossi." Bruno's new lawyer, a man named Donovan Pike, shot to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, this is slanderous speculation. They have no evidence for these outlandish claims." Judge Albright peered over her glasses. "It is an opening statement, Mr. Pike, not testimony. She is allowed to state what she intends to prove." "Sit down." Pike sat, his face flushed. "To prove our case," Jenkins continued, "we will present correspondence, academic records, and expert testimony. But first, we wish to call a witness who can speak directly to the timeline of these events and the nature of the core asset in question." "And who would that be?" Judge Albright asked, raising an eyebrow. Before Jenkins could answer, a voice cut through the courtroom from the back. "Your Honor, if I may have a moment." Every head in the room swiveled. Standing near the entrance was Arthur Finch. He was not dressed in his usual power suit, but in a more muted conservative grey. He held a simple leather briefcase. He walked with a deliberate, solemn pace down the central aisle. Bruno went rigid in his seat. He stared at Arthur, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and disbelief. What was he doing here? Donovan Pike jumped up again. "Your Honor, what is the meaning of this? Mr. Finch is Mr. Thorne's former counsel. He has no standing here." Arthur Finch stopped before the bar. He gave a slight respectful bow to the judge. "Your Honor, my name is Arthur Finch. As the court knows, I recently withdrew as counsel for the defendant. I am here today in a personal capacity. For what purpose, Mr. Finch?" Judge Albright asked, her voice laced with intrigue. "I have filed a motion with your clerk this morning." "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice resonating with clarity and authority. "A motion to be added to the petitioner's witness list." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was a sonic boom of shock. Lawyers whispered furiously to each other. Journalists scribbled frantically in their notepads. A lawyer switching sides to testify against a former high-profile client was almost unheard of. It was a spectacular breach of the unspoken code, a kamikaze move that could end a career. Bruno Thorne looked as if he'd been physically struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. "No," he mouthed silently. On what grounds? Donovan Pike sputtered, completely flustered. "Attorney-client privilege is absolute. This is a disgrace, a professional and ethical violation of the highest order. I am fully aware of my ethical obligations, Mr. Pike." Arthur said, his gaze coolly dismissing the other lawyer, before turning back to the judge. "I will not be testifying to any privileged communications I had with Mr. Thorne. I am here to testify as a fact witness. I am here to testify about evidence presented to me by the petitioner in a deposition at which I was present as Mr. Thorne's counsel. I am here to testify to my own direct knowledge of the Prometheus algorithm's architecture gained through years of non-privileged work on patent and copyright filings for Thorne Capital. And I am here to testify as an expert in intellectual property litigation that the equations presented in Exhibit A are, in my professional opinion, the undeniable source code for Mr. Thorne's entire business." He placed his briefcase on the petitioner's table and gave a slight nod to Isabella. She met his gaze and nodded, back an alliance forged in the pursuit of truth. Judge Albright stared at Arthur for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable. The courtroom held its breath. The decision she made in the next 30 seconds would determine the fate of everyone in the room. Finally, she looked at Bruno Thorne, whose facade of power had completely crumbled, revealing the panicked, hollow man beneath. Then, she looked at Isabella, whose quiet determination seemed to fill the space around her. "Mr. Pike," the judge said, her voice sharp as a razor, "your objection is noted and for now overruled. The extent to which Mr. Finch can testify will be determined question by question, with strict adherence to the rules of privilege." She turned her gaze to Arthur. "Mr. Finch, you are playing with fire, and I trust you know the consequences." "I do, Your Honor," Arthur said. "Very well," Judge Albright declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Ms. Jenkins, you may call your first witness." Sarah Jenkins smiled, a small, triumphant curve of her lips. "The petitioner calls Arthur Finch to the stand." The sound of the gavel striking the block sealed it. Arthur Finch, the gladiator. Bruno had sent to destroy his wife, walked past him, without a glance, took the oath and sat in the witness box, ready to burn his own career to the ground, to expose the lie at the heart of the Thorne empire. For Bruno, the laughter had officially dead. The public execution had begun. Arthur Finch's testimony was a masterclass in controlled demolition. He spoke calmly, dispassionately, and with devastating precision. He never once mentioned a private conversation with Bruno. He didn't have to. Guided by Sarah Jenkins's careful questioning, he simply laid fact upon fact, creating an unshakable edifice of truth. He authenticated the deposition where Isabella had presented her father's letter. He identified specific non-privileged documents, patent filings he himself had prepared years ago, and placed them side by side with enlargements of Alistair Ross's academic papers and personal correspondence. He walked the court through the mathematical logic, explaining in layman's terms how the revolutionary core of the Prometheus algorithm was a direct copy of Ross's theory of stochastic resonance. "So Mr. Finch Jenkins," asked, her voice clear in the rapt courtroom, "in your expert opinion, having represented Mr. Thorne and his company for 15 years, could the Prometheus algorithm exist without the foundational work of Dr. Alistair Rossi?" Arthur looked directly at the judge. "No. In my opinion, the work of Dr. Rossi is not the foundation. It is the entire building. Everything else was merely decoration." Donovan Pike's cross-examination was a disaster. He tried to impeach Arthur's character, painting him as a disgruntled, fired employee seeking revenge. Isn't it true, Mr. Finch, that you had a falling out with Mr. Thorne over fees? Pike asked, grasping at straws. No, that is not true, Arthur replied calmly. So you're doing this out of the goodness of your heart, a man of your reputation committing professional suicide for… What? A moral crusade, Pike sneered. Arthur leaned forward slightly. I am here, Mr. Pike, because I am an officer of the court, and when I am presented with irrefutable evidence that a fraud is being perpetrated upon this court, and indeed upon the entire financial world, my duty is not to the man who paid my invoices. My duty is to the truth. The testimony lasted 2 days. By the end, Bruno Thorne's case was not just broken, it was vaporized. But the damage was just beginning. The reporters in the gallery, smelling the biggest financial scandal of the decade, had been filing updates constantly. The headlines were brutal. Thorne Capital, built on stolen IP, says former lawyer Wall Street titan, accused of massive fraud in divorce. Caught, the ghost of Prometheus. Did Bruno Thorne steal his billion-dollar algorithm? The market reacts to information, and this information was toxic. By the time the court adjourned on the second day, Thorne Capital's institutional investors were in a full-blown panic. The fund was built on the myth of Bruno's singular genius. With that myth, shattered confidence evaporated. Redemption calls requests from investors to pull their money out flooded the firm. It was a digital bank run. Within a week, the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, announced a formal investigation into Thorne Capital for securities fraud and failure to disclose material information to investors. Federal agents from the Southern District of New York, famous for prosecuting Wall Street criminals, were seen carrying boxes out of Thorne Capital's gleaming headquarters. Bruno's world unraveled with astonishing speed. The friends who had once clamored for his attention and sought his advice now crossed the street to avoid him. His credit lines were frozen. His board of directors, the one he had stacked with allies, demanded his immediate resignation. He was a pariah. The most cutting blow came not from the courts or the SEC, but from the quiet dignity of Isabella's actions. She wasn't vindictive. Her lawsuit didn't ask for half of his fortune in the traditional sense. It asked for something far more fundamental, a declaratory judgment, officially naming Alistair Rossi as the creator of the intellectual property. It asked for the algorithm and all its profits to be placed in a constructive trust administered by the court. She wasn't trying to take his money for herself. She was trying to reclaim her father's name. The final image of Bruno Thorne's downfall wasn't of a dramatic courtroom confrontation. It was a press photo of him leaving the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan after being indicted. He looked haggard, shrunken, lost in a suit that now seemed too big for him. The arrogant titan was gone, replaced by a frightened old man, scurrying through a sea of flashing cameras, his face a mask of utter desolation. He had built his identity on a mountain of gold, but the mountain was built on a lie. When the lie was exposed, there was nothing left. He had laughed at the threat of divorce, believing his wealth made him invincible. He never understood that his real vulnerability wasn't in his bank account, but in the truth he had tried so desperately to bury. He had lost far more than his money. He had lost his name, his legacy, and himself. The unraveling was complete. The legal dust settled not with a bang, but with the slow grinding finality of the justice system. The court's ruling was a landmark, creating what legal scholars would later dub the Rossi precedent. It declared that an asset's origin, if proven fraudulent, tainted every subsequent profit. It was a surgical strike that didn't just divide marital assets, but annihilated the legitimacy of Bruno Thorne's entire life's work. A constructive trust was formed, a complex legal entity that seized control of every stock bond and dollar ever earned through the stolen algorithm. Bruno Thorne's fall was absolute. Facing an ironclad federal case, he accepted a plea deal. His sentencing was a pathetic affair. The cavernous federal courtroom, once a stage for his power, now felt like his tomb. Dressed in an off-the-rack suit his new, less prestigious lawyers had provided, he was a ghost of his former self. He was sentenced to 12 years in a medium-security federal prison. The last public image of him was not of a titan, but of a broken man in an ill-fitting suit, his hands cuffed in front of him, staring blankly as his former driver, now employed by a ride-sharing service, drove past the courthouse without a glance. He was left with only his premarital assets, a sum that was considerable to an ordinary person, but was a pauper's pittance to him, a constant, galling reminder of the kingdom he had lost. But this story was never truly about his deserved punishment. It was about Isabella's deliberate reconstruction of a life and a legacy. She did not touch a single dollar from the trust for personal use. The first thing she did was walk through the Greenwich mansion one last time, not with movers but with appraisers from Sotheby's and Christie's. The Basquiat, the wine collection, the closets full of unworn couture, the vault of jewellery. It was all methodically catalogued and sold. She kept nothing but her father's books and a few personal photographs. She watched as the symbols of her gilded cage were carted away, feeling not loss, but the lightness of a soul unburdened. With the formidable assets from the trust, she began her life's real work. She established the Rossi Foundation for Ethical Innovation. Its announcement was met with cynicism in some circles. Wall Street traders scoffed at the St. Isabella Fund, viewing it as a naive conscience-laundering vanity project. They predicted it would fail within a year. They misunderstood Isabella completely. She was not a sentimental widow. She was her father's daughter, armed with his intellect and a will of iron forged in years of silent suffering. The foundation's headquarters were established in a beautifully restored brownstone in Cambridge, just a few blocks from her father's old, book-filled apartment. The space was designed not for intimidation, but for collaboration. Warm wood, abundant natural light, and whiteboards covered in ideas instead of walls covered in expensive art. Its mission was radical: to find and fund the Alistair Rosses of the world, brilliant minds on the verge of breakthroughs, often overlooked by venture capitalists seeking quick explosive returns. The foundation offered not just grants but legal protection for intellectual property, ensuring these innovators would never suffer her father's fate. She persuaded a reluctant but intrigued Professor Davies to serve as the chairman of the board. The first board meeting was a tense affair. A young, aggressive fund manager she'd hired argued for investing in a high-yield, borderline predatory fintech app to grow their endowment quickly. Isabella listened patiently, then calmly vetoed him. Instead, she directed their first major grant to a quiet, unassuming biochemist at the University of Freiburg, whose research on enzyme-based plastic degradation had been repeatedly rejected for funding because it was deemed not commercially scalable within a 5-year window. It was a statement of intent. The Rossi Foundation would measure its returns not in dollars but in impact. Arthur Finch's story found its own quiet, profound resolution. He was censured by the New York State Bar Association. The public rebuke was a deep wound to his professional pride, and he was forced into retirement from the firm that bore his name. He sold his palatial Manhattan condo and moved to a smaller, book-lined apartment near Columbia University. Yet those who knew him saw a man transformed. The perpetual tension in his shoulders was gone. He accepted a position as a full-time professor of legal ethics at Columbia Law School and served as the Rossi Foundation's pro bono general counsel. His case study of Thorn v. Thorn lecture became the most sought-after class at the law school. He would stand before the students not as a fallen gladiator, but as a wise, weary mentor. A lawyer's highest duty is to the law, not the client. He'd tell them, his voice raspy but firm. Most of you will never face a choice as stark as mine, but you will face 1,000 smaller ones. You will be asked to bend a rule, to bury a memo, to look the other way. And it is in those small moments that you will forge your character or sell your soul piece by piece. Choose wisely. One crisp autumn afternoon, 2 years after the verdict, Isabella stood in the main hall of the foundation. The space was filled with a quiet hum of activity. On a large digital display, a map of the world glowed with points of light, each one a project they funded the water purification system in a Vietnamese village, the open-source literacy software being used in inner-city schools, the successful clinical trial of a new, low-cost malaria diagnostic in Ghana. To her left, encased in museum-grade CD glass, was her father's journal open to a page of his elegant equations. She often saw students and visiting academics standing before it speaking in hushed, reverent tones. His name was no longer a footnote in Bruno Thorne's fabricated story. It was an inspiration. Her assistant handed her the afternoon mail. Among the letters was a handwritten card with a German postmark. It was from the biochemist in Freiburg. "Dear Ms. Rossi," it read, "we have had a breakthrough. The enzymes are more effective than we ever dreamed. This could change everything. None of it would have been possible without you or without the spirit of your father, who reminds us that the greatest discoveries are born, not from a desire for profit, but from a love for knowledge. Thank you." Isabella held the card, her fingers tracing the simple, heartfelt words. She looked from the letter to her father's journal, then to the glowing map of the world. He had built an empire to feed his ego. She had built a foundation to honor a ghost. And in doing so, she had given her father's legacy a life more vibrant and meaningful than he could have ever imagined. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's mansion. She was Isabella Rossi, the master of her own house, a house built not on lies or stolen fire, but on a new foundation of truth, purpose, and enduring love. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a divorce. It was a story about the true nature of wealth. Bruno Thorne believed wealth was a shield, an impenetrable fortress of money and power that made him immune to consequence. He was wrong. He learned that a fortune built on a lie is a house of cards ready to collapse at the first whisper of truth. Isabella Rossi, left with nothing but a memory and a moral compass, proved that true wealth lies in integrity, legacy, and the courage to fight for what is right, even when the odds seem impossible. What do you believe is the ultimate form of justice? Is it watching the powerful fall, or is it seeing the wronged rise up and build something better from the ashes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of secrets, betrayal, and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please honor the truth by hitting that like button, share it with someone who loves a story of the underdog, and be sure to subscribe for more real-life dramas you won't forget. Thank you for listening.